Hello everyone, good morning. First of all, warm welcome to OIC training by Unogeeks. In this video, I'll give you a comparison between a global and a scope level fault handlers. I'll talk about, first I'll talk about the differences between those two. I'll explain should you use both or not, and I'll explain the good design practices when it comes to fault handling. Okay, so any integration you build in real time, you need to define it. It's not a case of either or. You have to define both a global level fault handler and a scope level fault handler. Any integration you build should definitely have a global level fault handler to capture any unhandled faults raised within the integration flow. Okay, so if we go back to the previous to the integration that we were building earlier, or that we used earlier to explore the error handling framework. So let me just go back to the integration flow. So if we go back to integrations, so we have built a REST API which will take a number as an input, multiplies it with itself, and it sends the result back to the calling client. So let me deactivate this API and show you the error handling that we have done in the previous videos. So we have error handling done at a global level for this API. Yes, for any API you build in real time, you definitely have to configure the global fault handler. And the reason why you have to do it is, in case there is any fault raised within a scope which is not handled by the fault handler, remember you can configure fault handler to handle a specific exceptions. You can configure it in such a way that it handles all the exceptions, or you can configure it to handle a specific exception. So in case you have an exception raised from action within a scope, but if that is not handled by the fault handler, then it will be thrown back to the global fault, and it will be handled here at the global fault handler level. Or in case you have an action which is outside of the scope and you don't have scope around that action, and if that raises a fault, those faults also will go to a global fault handler. Or in simpler terms, any unhandled faults within the integration flow will be handled by global fault handler. So it is quite important to define global fault handler for every integration you create in real time. That's point number one. Point number two, regarding the scope level fault handler, you should use scopes to the extent possible. Okay, so I would say use scope as much as possible, and never ever have an action outside of a scope. Okay, so that is like exposing an action without a fault handler. So any API that you build, any API or a SOAP service you build, the moment a trigger connection is configured, open up a scope like this and then start plugging in actions into the scope. And if you can segregate actions into a distinct sets, you could probably have multiple scopes, multiple independent scopes, or you can have a nested scopes as well. So if you use scope and configure fault handlers, that gives you a better control on the fault handling. And it helps you to exactly pinpoint what a web server might have thrown the fault, or where exactly the integration might have or error might have occurred within the integration flow. Because if you have multiple scopes, you can configure multiple fault handlers, and from those fault handlers, you can send out appropriate error messages, so that the scope level fault handler gives you a better control. So it's not a case of either or. You need to have a scope level fault handlers defined, and you also need to have a global level fault handler defined. And what will take precedence in case you have both? As you would have guessed it, the scope level fault handler takes precedence. Any error raised within from an action within a scope, first it will go to the fault handler and see how the fault handler is configured. If it is configured to handle the fault gets handled there itself, and it will not be thrown back to the global fault. In case the fault handler is not configured, remember, even if you have a scope, if you don't configure the fault handler, that would be as good as an unhandled fault, and it will go back to the global fault handler. Okay, so just to recap, define both global fault handler and a scope level fault handler in the integrations you build in real time. And if you have both, a scope level fault handler will take precedence, and only the unhandled exceptions from the integration will be thrown to the global fault handler. And remember, this global means global to the integration. It's not global to the OIC. Okay. And in the next video, I'll show you how to use throw new fault and rethrow fault actions. So you've got a couple of actions that you can use to explicitly raise a new fault. And you can also rethrow a fault in case you probably don't want to handle a fault at a scope level. You could rethrow it back to the global level, or maybe to the parent scope. So I'll show you how to use these two options in the next video. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys. In case you are interested in Oracle Integration Cloud training offered by Unogeeks, please call us on this number 739603355, or you can send a WhatsApp message. Thank you.